10 songs from the 60s and 70s that divided a generation. Hook. The 1960s and 1970s weren't just about new music. They were about arguments, at dinner tables, on radio call-in shows, between parents and their kids. Songs stopped being background noise. They became positions. Some tracks didn't just top charts. They split listeners down the middle. Number 10, Alice's Restaurant Massacre, Arlo Guthrie, 1967. This didn't sound like a hit song. It was 18 minutes long. There was no chorus, no hook, just a story, a rambling, humorous monologue about littering, Thanksgiving dinner, and getting drafted into the Vietnam War. Young listeners loved it immediately. They laughed at the absurdity. They recognized the frustration. They understood the joke hiding inside the story. Older listeners didn't. To them, this wasn't music. It wasn't protest. It wasn't respectful. It sounded lazy, disorganized, borderline offensive. But that was the point. Arlo Guthrie used humor to expose bureaucracy. He turned something small, throwing away trash, into a symbol of a system that punished the wrong people for the wrong reasons. The draft board scene mattered. A young man questioned not for violence, but for thinking differently. Kids heard satire. Parents heard mockery of authority. Radio stations were split. Some refused to play it at all. Others aired it once a year as a tradition by the early 1970s. Alice's Restaurant Massacre had become ritual listening for one generation and a source of irritation for another. It didn't ask for agreement. It demanded patience, and patience was already in short supply. The song didn't divide people because it was radical. It divided them because it refused to behave like a song or show respect to systems younger listeners no longer trusted. Number 9, Ohio, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, 1970. This song didn't wait for perspective. It didn't wait for investigations. It didn't wait for calm. It reacted. In May 1970, 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard at Kent State University. Neil Young saw the photos. He wrote the song immediately. Within days, it was recorded and released. That speed mattered. Young listeners heard urgency, anger that matched what they felt, a refusal to let the moment fade. Older listeners heard something else. Accusation. The song named the event, named the state, and pointed blame upward. Tin soldiers and Nixon coming. That line crossed a line for many adults. Radio stations were split. Some played it hourly, others banned it outright. They said it was too political, too raw, too divisive. Parents accused the band of exploiting tragedy. Students accused silence of doing worse. There was no neutral ground. Ohio wasn't asking listeners to reflect. It was demanding they choose. Was the problem the violence, or the song that refused to soften it? The track runs barely 4 minutes. There's no metaphor to hide behind, no distance, just names, dates, and grief turned into sound. For one generation, this was truth arriving at the exact right time. For the other, it was proof that music had gone too far. Ohio divided listeners because it refused to translate pain into comfort. Number 8, God Save the Queen, Sex Pistols, 1977. This song wasn't misunderstood. It was understood perfectly, and rejected anyway. Released during Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee, God Save the Queen arrived as a direct challenge to British identity itself. The title alone felt like provocation. The lyrics removed any doubt. No future. Young listeners heard honesty, a generation locked out of opportunity, unimpressed by ceremony, angry at institutions that felt permanent and indifferent. Older listeners heard insult, not metaphor, not critique, disrespect. The song was banned by the BBC. Major retailers refused to stock it. Politicians condemned it publicly. It still reached number 2 on the UK charts, blocked from number 1 under circumstances many believed were deliberate. That only deepened the divide. To fans, the song said what polite society refused to admit, that tradition didn't equal protection, that loyalty wasn't being returned. To critics, it was nihilism, noise masquerading as rebellion, a threat disguised as music. There was no middle position. The Sex Pistols didn't explain themselves. They didn't soften the edges. They wanted confrontation. God Save the Queen didn't ask whether the system worked. Number 7. I-Feel-Like-I'm-Fixin to Die Rag, Country Joe and the Fish, 1967. This song smiled while it delivered the message. A cheerful melody, a sing-along chorus, the structure of a vaudeville number, and lyrics about sending young men to die. That contrast was intentional. Country Joe McDonald wrote it as open mockery of politicians, of generals, of the language used to sell war. Young listeners understood the joke immediately. They laughed because it felt like relief, someone finally saying the quiet part out loud. Older listeners didn't laugh at all. They heard disrespect. They heard soldiers being mocked. They heard patriotism turned into a punchline. The song spelled it out. No metaphor, no ambiguity, draft notices, body counts, profits, and it invited the audience to sing along. That invitation mattered. It made listeners complicit. It turned critique into participation. Radio stations reacted fast. Many refused to play it. Others buried it late at night. Live performances changed everything. When Country Joe led crowds at festivals, most famously at Woodstock, tens of thousands joined in. That image frightened people. Not because of volume, because of unity. I-Feel-Like-I'm-Fixin to Die Rag divided a generation by using humor where respect was expected. For one side, it was truth delivered plainly. For the other, it was proof that protest had crossed into mockery. The song didn't ask for understanding. It asked listeners to laugh at something others demanded be taken seriously. Number 6, Fortunate Son, Creedence Clearwater Revival, 1969. This song arrived with no subtlety, a sharp riff, a clipped vocal, a message delivered fast and loud. Fortunate Son didn't protest war in general, it protested who fought it. John Fogerty wrote it after watching Politicians' sons avoid the draft, while working-class kids were sent overseas. Young listeners recognized it immediately. They heard class anger. They heard fairness being questioned. They heard something no one in power wanted said plainly. Older listeners often heard something else. Disrespect. They accused the song of being anti-American, anti-military, unpatriotic. That reading missed the target. The song wasn't attacking soldiers, it was attacking privilege. But it didn't slow down to explain that distinction. Radio stations were divided. Some played it constantly. Others hesitated, worried about backlash. Parents asked why music sounded so angry. Kids asked why the truth sounded threatening. The chorus made the divide unavoidable. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate son. No poetry. No ambiguity. Just a declaration that the system wasn't equal. Fortunate Son split generations because it forced listeners to confront who paid the price and who didn't. For one side, it felt like long overdue honesty. For the other, it felt like betrayal. And once that accusation landed, there was no way to hear the song without choosing a side. Number 5, Sympathy for the Devil, The Rolling Stones, 1968. This song didn't whisper its intentions. It announced them. A hypnotic rhythm, a chant-like chorus, and lyrics sung from the perspective of the devil himself. For younger listeners, it felt provocative in the right way. Smart, ironic, a challenge to blind morality. For older listeners, it felt dangerous, not symbolic, not theatrical, blasphemous. The song walked through history, wars, assassinations, revolutions, and placed responsibility not on demons, but on human behavior. That idea mattered. Some listeners heard critique, others heard glorification. There was no agreement on tone. Was Mick Jagger condemning evil or celebrating it? The Stones refused to clarify. Religious groups protested. Radio stations received complaints. Concerts turned tense. The chaos at Altamont later that year cemented the song's reputation, fairly or not. To critics, Sympathy for the Devil symbolized everything wrong with rock music's influence. Confusing morality, mocking tradition, inviting darkness. To fans, it symbolized maturity, the idea that music could confront evil without pretending it didn't exist. That difference in interpretation was the divide. The song didn't tell listeners what to think. It asked them to recognize themselves. In uncomfortable places, for one generation, that felt necessary. For the other, it felt like a line crossed. Sympathy for the Devil didn't split audiences because it praised Satan. It split them because it suggested evil wasn't external. It was human, and that idea was far more unsettling. Number 4, Light My Fire, The Doors, 1967.
If I want to say to you, girl, we could.
This song didn't sound threatening. It sounded seductive. A swirling organ line, a slow build, a chorus that felt intimate rather than aggressive. Young listeners heard freedom, possibility, a loosening of rules they'd inherited. Older listeners heard something else. They heard implication. They heard sexuality slipping past the guardrails of pop radio. They heard a loss of control. The title alone was enough to raise eyebrows. Jim Morrison never explained it. He didn't need to. Ambiguity was the weapon. When the Doors performed the song on The Ed Sullivan Show, Morrison was asked to change a single word. He didn't. The band sang it anyway. That moment mattered. To younger audiences, it was defiance, a small but symbolic refusal to edit desire for approval. To older audiences, it was disrespect, proof that rock musicians couldn't be trusted with influence. Radio stations edited it. Television networks hesitated. Parents warned their kids. But the song kept spreading. Its long instrumental passages felt hypnotic. Its lyrics invited interpretation rather than instruction. That openness became the problem. Light My Fire didn't tell listeners what to do. It suggested how it might feel. For one generation, that invitation felt honest. For the other, it felt like temptation masquerading as art. The song divided audiences because it refused to explain itself or reassure anyone listening. And once desire entered pop music without apology, there was no closing that door again. Number 3, White Rabbit, Jefferson Airplane, 1967. This song didn't hide its intentions. It disguised them. A bolero rhythm, a slow, controlled rise, a climax that felt inevitable. Grace Slick sang it like a warning, not a celebration. Young listeners heard permission, an invitation to question authority and experience the world differently. Older listeners heard panic. They recognized the references. Pills, mushrooms, altered states. The song never said the word drugs. It didn't need to. It borrowed children's literature and twisted it just enough to make adults uncomfortable. That was the point. Radio stations argued over it. Some banned it immediately. Others played it quietly, late at night. Parents accused it of corrupting youth. Kids insisted it was metaphor. Both sides were right. White Rabbit divided a generation because it refused to tell listeners what was metaphor and what was instruction. The final line sealed it. Feed your head. To one audience, that sounded like curiosity. To the other, it sounded like danger. The song didn't ask for trust. It asked for surrender. And once music suggested, that reality itself was negotiable. No generation could agree on where the line was anymore. Number 2, For What It's Worth, Buffalo Springfield, 1966.
What it is ain't exactly clear.
This song sounded calm, a gentle guitar line, a restrained vocal. No shouting, no slogans. That quietness was deceptive. Young listeners heard recognition. Something felt wrong, and the song admitted it. Older listeners heard unease without direction. The lyrics described confusion, people carrying signs, lines being drawn, a sense that something was happening. But nobody was sure what. It wasn't written about Vietnam. It wasn't written about revolution. It was about fear. That distinction didn't matter. Radio stations played it constantly, and listeners projected their own meaning onto it. To students, it sounded like protest. To parents, it sounded like warning. Some accused the song of encouraging unrest. Others accused it of not going far enough.
Telling me I got to beware.
The song never clarified. Stephen Stills didn't tell listeners who was right. He didn't name enemies. He didn't offer solutions. That refusal frustrated both sides. In an era demanding certainty, For what it's worth, offered only observation, and that made it divisive. The chorus didn't demand action. It suggested awareness. There's something happening here. That line landed differently depending on age. To one generation, it felt like honesty. To the other, it felt like surrender to chaos. The song became an anthem without choosing a cause. And in doing so, it forced listeners to bring their own. That space between meaning and intent is where the division lived. Number 1, Eve of Destruction, Barry Maguire, 1965.
What's that gun you're toting? And even the Jordan River has.
This song didn't whisper, it shouted. From the first verse, there was no room for interpretation. Maguire listed the world's failures one by one. Vietnam, racial violence, nuclear fear, political hypocrisy. Nothing was hidden in metaphor, nothing softened for radio. The message was blunt. The world was falling apart. Radio stations panicked. Some banned it immediately, others played it once, then pulled it after angry phone calls. Commentators called it reckless, un-American, dangerous. They said it spread fear. They said it encouraged despair. They were right about one thing. It did spread fear, because it refused to pretend everything was fine. Young listeners embraced it. They heard honesty. They heard someone finally saying out loud what the nightly news tried to sanitize. Older listeners heard collapse, a loss of control, a song telling their children that authority could not be trusted. There was no middle ground. Unlike other protest songs of the era, Eve of Destruction offered no hope, no resolution, no vision of a better tomorrow, just urgency, just warning. And that's why it divided more deeply than any song before it. You couldn't dance to it. You couldn't ignore it. You couldn't reinterpret it. You either accepted its premise or rejected it entirely. In a decade obsessed with choosing sides, this song forced the choice immediately. Not tomorrow, not eventually. Now.